Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and we have a really intense one for you today.
Yeah, I'm the resident psychology expert for this deep dive, and you're not kidding. This material is heavy.
It really is. So let's just jump right in. How do normal, everyday people end up committing, the atrocities of Nazi Germany or joining the mass suicide at Jonestown?
Right, or even the 9/11 hijackers.
Exactly. When we look at these historical horrors, we desperately want to believe that those individuals were just, well, born monsters. We want to draw this stark, comforting line between us and them.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
We want to label those actions as the result of uniquely evil or, completely broken personalities. It's incredibly comforting to think that way.
Because if they're just monsters, then we're safe, right?
Exactly. We naturally want to categorize the unfathomable, so we just don't have to imagine ourselves being capable of it.
Yeah.
But when you dive into the research we've pulled together on social psychology for today, that clean categorization just completely shatters.
Yeah, the sources paint a pretty dark picture.
They do. We are looking at a landscape of human behavior that is terrifyingly fluid.
And that is the exact mission we're tackling in this deep dive. We aren't asking, who were those monsters? We're asking, how could seemingly ordinary people be pushed to do the unthinkable?
And to answer that, we have to confront this massive blind spot in human cognition. It's called the fundamental attribution error.
Right.
Our brains are practically hardwired to make this specific mistake.
Yeah.
When we observe someone doing something terrible or even just acting a bit strange, we immediately blame their character.
We think, oh, they're just a bad person.
Exactly. We overestimate their underlying personality, and we vastly underestimate the invisible, overwhelming power of the physical and social situation they're currently trapped in.
Let me put this into a really low-stakes, everyday context for you listening right now. Imagine you get an email from a brand new coworker you've never met, and it is just riddled with typos. Punctuation is a total mess. Your immediate instinct is probably to judge their character, right? You assume they're lazy, unprofessional, or maybe just, not that bright.
And you've just fallen right into the trap of the fundamental attribution error.
Right.
You're making a sweeping judgment about who they are as a person based on a single data point, and you're completely ignoring the surrounding context.
Because what you don't know is the situational factor. You have no idea that maybe English isn't their native language.
Right, or they were typing that email one-handed on a phone while sitting in the waiting room of an emergency room.
Exactly. We are completely blind to the situation. And if our brains fail to account for the situation in a simple email exchange, it's staggering to think about how blind we are to the monumental situational forces that can drive mass atrocities.
That is the core of our exploration today. We're going to serve as your shortcut to understanding the mechanics of social influence. We're taking this stack of psychological research and, well, pulling back the curtain on the hidden forces that shape everything around us.
But to understand the extreme stuff, the cults and the dictatorships, we actually can't start there, can we?
No, you have to start smaller. We have to start with the most basic, elemental, situational force in human existence.
Which is just having another human being in the same room as you.
Just the physical presence of an audience. It fundamentally alters our biology and our behavior. There was this early observation by a psychologist named Norman Cripplet, who noticed something pretty fascinating about bicycle racers.
Oh, yeah, the cycling study.
Right. They consistently clocked significantly faster times when they were racing alongside other cyclists compared to when they were just doing time trials alone against a clock.
So just having people around made them faster.
He called it social facilitation. The sheer presence of co-actors gives us a performance boost.
I hear that, but it definitely cannot be a universal rule.
What do you mean?
Well, think about parallel parking. If I'm trying to parallel park my car on a busy street and I know people on the sidewalk are watching me, I completely fall apart.
Oh, the pressure is awful.
Right. I lose all ability to judge distance. The audience makes me actively worse.
You are definitely not alone in that feeling. That's a phenomenon known as social inhibition. For a long time, psychologists were totally baffled by this apparent contradiction.
Like, why does an audience turn a cyclist into a superstar, but turn a driver into a nervous wreck?
Exactly. But the research eventually cracked the code, and it all comes down to attention. Having an audience is inherently distracting. It creates this state of physiological arousal and mental overload that forces our brains to drastically narrow our focus.
Oh, I see where this is going. If you're doing something easy or something you've practiced a million times, like riding a bike,
Narrowing your focus is actually great.
yeah, it blocks out the background noise and you perform better.
That is social facilitation in a nutshell. But think about parallel parking.
It's way more complicated.
It is a highly complex task with a lot of shifting variables.
Yeah.
You need a wide focus to process the mirrors, the pedestrians, the angle of the curb.
So when the audience forces your brain to narrow its attention, you drop crucial information.
You crash and burn. Researchers demonstrated this brilliantly with the Stroop task.
Remind me, that's the color test, right?
Yeah, the classic visual puzzle where the word red is printed in blue ink, and you have to name the ink color out loud.
Oh man, that test is agonizing. Your brain is practically screaming at you to just read the word, and you have to fight your own wiring to look at the color instead.
It is incredibly frustrating because it's a complex cognitive task. But the data shows something amazing. When people are closely watched by an audience, they actually perform much better on the Stroop task.
Wait, really? The pressure makes them better at it.
Yes, because the audience narrows their attention so intensely that they develop tunnel vision. They literally stop processing the distracting word and are only able to focus on the raw ink color.
Wow.
The social pressure functionally rewires how their brain processes visual information in real time.
That is wild to think about. Just having someone stand next to you changes your cognitive processing. But let's take that concept and multiply it. What happens when it's not just one person watching you, but you are submerged in a massive crowd?
Then we enter the territory of de-individuation. This is the psychological state where being in a crowd strips away our personal identity.
We just sort of blend in.
Right, we lose our internal sense of public accountability. You see this clearly in studies involving children on Halloween.
Oh, the candy bowl study.
Yeah. Kids who are trick-or-treating in large groups and who are wearing masks that hide their identity will steal significantly more candy from an unattended bowl compared to kids who are alone or kids who have been forced to tell the homeowner their name.
I want to challenge the traditional narrative on this a bit, though. The classic Hollywood idea of mob mentality suggests that if you put on a mask and become anonymous, it just unleashes this repressed inner dark side.
Like we just naturally turn into monsters.
Right. But if anonymity just breeds pure aggression, how do we explain the nurse uniform study from the sources?
That is a phenomenal piece of research to bring up. For those unfamiliar, researchers in the 70s ran a study where they asked participants to administer fake electric shocks to others.
Which is already pretty intense.
It is. One group of participants was dressed in outfits that resembled Ku Klux Klan robes. Another group was dressed in standard nurses' uniforms. And a third control group just wore their everyday clothes.
Now, if the mod mentality theory holds true, both the KKK group and the nurse group should have become highly aggressive, right? Because both groups were anonymous behind their costumes.
Exactly.
But that's not what happened. The people wearing the nurse uniforms actually became significantly less aggressive than the people wearing their normal everyday clothes.
Which forces a complete rethink of what de-individuation actually does. Anonymity doesn't just erase your moral compass. It makes you hypersensitive to the specific social norms of your immediate environment.
So it's about the cues you're getting from your surroundings.
Everything around you, the outfit you're wearing, the setting, the behavior of the crowd, it all broadcasts a rule book. A KKK outfit broadcasts a norm of aggression and hostility. A nurse uniform broadcasts a norm of care and healing.
So when you lose your personal identity in a crowd, you don't become a blank slate. You instantly absorb and adopt the group's identity.
Yes.
It's like your brain goes on autopilot and just downloads whatever software the situation hands you.
That's a great way to put it.
So if a uniform or crowd can completely rewrite how we act, it's terrifying to think about how a crowd can also give us permission to do absolutely nothing at all.
You're referring to the bystander effect.
Yeah.
It is one of the most chilling phenomena in social psychology. The catalyst for all this research was the tragic 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York.
Right. Early reports suggested that dozens of neighbors heard her screaming or saw parts of the attack, yet no one called the police for over half an hour.
Which on the surface sounds like an entire apartment complex populated by psychopaths.
It really does.
While historical deep dives have since shown that the initial reporting actually exaggerated the number of witnesses and their vantage points, the sheer horror of that public apathy kicked off decades of rigorous psychological testing.
And the findings were pretty solid, weren't they?
Incredibly robust. You are statistically less likely to receive help in an emergency if there are many people around than if there's just a single bystander.
Because everyone just assumes the guy next to them is going to handle it.
That's a major piece of the puzzle, but it actually breaks down into two distinct mechanisms. The first is called pluralistic ignorance, and it governs how we handle ambiguous situations.
Ambiguous like. Not quite sure if it's an emergency.
Exactly. Imagine you're sitting in a waiting room, filling out a questionnaire for a study, and suddenly thick smoke starts billowing out of the air conditioning vent.
I am immediately dropping the clipboard and sprinting out the door.
If you're sitting in that room alone, the data backs you up. The vast majority of people who are alone report the smoke immediately. But researchers ran this exact scenario with people sitting in groups of 3.
Damn.
In that group setting, only a tiny fraction of people ever got up to report the smoke.
How is that even possible? The room is literally filling with smoke. Are they just ignoring it?
They aren't ignoring it, they're trying to interpret it. Emergencies are often confusing in the first few seconds. Is it dangerous smoke, or is it just harmless steam from a broken radiator?
Oh, I see.
Because you aren't completely sure, you don't want to look foolish by overreacting. So you try to play it cool, and you subtly glance around at the other people in the room to see how they are interpreting the situation.
But here's the trap. They're doing the exact same thing to you.
Everyone is looking at everyone else's fake, calm exterior.
Precisely. You see them sitting quietly, they see you sitting quietly. So as a collective, you unspokenly agree, well, since no one else is panicking, this must not be a real emergency.
That collective illusion is pluralistic ignorance.
I feel like I've experienced a non-lethal version of this so many times. Think about sitting in a massive, incredibly dense college lecture.
Oh, absolutely.
The professor finishes a brutally complicated equation on the board and asks, does anyone have any questions? Silence. Crickets. You are completely lost, but you look around the auditorium and everyone else looks perfectly calm and engaged.
So you assume it's just you.
Right. You assume you are the only person struggling, completely missing the fact that the entire room is secretly just as lost as you are, all hiding behind the same mask of competence.
That is a perfect everyday analogy. The research actually tracks this exact same dynamic in college binge drinking culture.
Really? How so?
Many students harbor deep private misgivings about the sheer volume of alcohol being consumed at a party. But they look around, see everyone else acting completely nonchalant, and falsely assume that they are the only ones feeling uncomfortable.
Wow.
So they drink more to conform to a norm that doesn't actually exist in anybody's private mind. They conform to an illusion.
That makes a lot of sense for ambiguous situations where you aren't sure what's going on. But what if the emergency is undeniable?
Like what?
Like, pluralistic ignorance can't explain why people ignore a clear-cut crisis, like someone actively having a heart attack on the sidewalk.
And that introduces the second mechanism, diffusion of responsibility.
Huh.
Researchers tested this by placing a participant in a room alone, communicating with a group of other people over an intercom system.
Okay.
During the discussion, one of the voices on the intercom suddenly starts having a severe, violent seizure, choking and begging for help.
Okay, there is zero ambiguity there. You know someone is dying.
None at all. And because they are in separate rooms, you can't see the other participants, so pluralistic ignorance is totally removed. When participants believed they were the only person listening on the intercom, nearly all of them rushed out into the hallway to find help.
That makes sense.
But when researchers told the participant that 5 other people were also dialed into the intercom line, the rate of helping plummeted.
So the sheer knowledge that other people exist in this scenario paralyzes you.
Exactly.
You tell yourself, I don't need to get involved. Someone else has already called 911. One of those other 5 people is probably a doctor.
The psychological burden of taking action and the potential guilt of doing nothing gets diluted and spread across the entire crowd. The larger the crowd, the thinner your personal sliver of responsibility becomes, until it's so thin you simply do nothing.
Okay, so we've explored how a crowd can trick us into ignoring a fire or paralyze us from saving someone's life. But what happens when the crowd isn't passive? What happens when a group actively pressures you to do something you know with absolute certainty is wrong?
To understand active compliance, we have to look at Solomon Asch's famous conformity experiments from the 1950s.
The line matching one, right?
Yeah, he designed a painfully simple test. He brought one real participant into a room filled with actors who pretended to be fellow participants. He showed the room a picture of a target line, and then a picture of 3 other lines of very obviously different lengths.
Okay.
He just went around the room and asked everyone to state out loud which of the three lines matched the target line.
A kindergarten-level matching game. There is a clearly correct answer.
It was designed to be undeniable. But Ash secretly instructed all the actors to unanimously choose the wrong line.
Oh, man.
The real participant was seated, so they had to answer next to last, meaning they had to sit there and listen to 5 people in a row confidently state an answer that was visibly incorrect.
I can only imagine the sheer internal panic of sitting in that chair. You know your eyes work, but you're thinking, am I losing my mind? Am I missing a trick?
The internal pressure was immense, and the results changed psychology forever. Even though the correct answer was physically obvious, a massive majority of the real participants conformed and gave the wrong answer at least once.
That's terrifying.
It is. The fear of being the odd one out, the fear of social exclusion and judgment completely overpower their own sensory perception. This is normative social influence. We would rather be wrong and fit in than be right and stand out.
But there is a silver lining in that research, isn't there? The spell of the crowd isn't unbreakable.
It is incredibly fragile, actually. Ash found that if he instructed just one of those actors to give a different answer, even if it was a different, incorrect answer, the conformity of the real participant plummeted.
That's fascinating.
Having just one single dissenting voice in the room destroyed the illusion of unanimity and gave the participant the psychological permission to trust their own eyes again.
It's empowering to think that it only takes one person to break a bad consensus. But Ash's experiment was just about matching lines on a piece of cardboard. The pressure to conform gets infinitely darker when we introduce authority figures. This brings us directly to Stanley Milgram's obedience studies, which are probably the most infamous experiments in all of psychology.
They truly are. Milgram wanted to test the limits of obedience. He brought participants into a lab and told them they were playing the role of a teacher in a memory experiment.
And there was a shock machine.
Yes. They sat in front of a massive shock generator. They were instructed to read pairs of words to a learner who was strapped into a chair in the next room. Every time the learner got an answer wrong, the teacher was ordered to deliver an electric shock.
And the shock generator wasn't just a single button. It was this intimidating row of switches, starting at a tiny 15 volts and escalating all the way up to a lethal 450 volts, marked simply with an ominous XXX.
Now, to be clear, the learner was an actor, and the shock machine was a prop. No one was actually being electrocuted, but the participant believed it was entirely real.
Which is the crazy part.
As the voltage increased, the actor in the next room would scream in agony, bang on the wall, complain of a heart condition, and eventually offer nothing but a terrifying dead silence.
So they thought they might have killed the guy.
Yeah. If the participant hesitated or asked to stop, the experimenter, a man in a gray lab coat, would simply give a calm, scripted prod. The experiment requires that you continue.
Milgram actually asked a panel of psychiatrists to predict the outcome before he ran the study. They confidently guessed that maybe 1 in 1,000 people, only true clinical psychopaths, would go all the way to 450 volts.
That was the expectation.
But the reality is that the vast majority of normal, everyday people, around 65%, administered the maximum lethal shock.
It is a profound failure of prediction by those psychiatrists because they committed the fundamental attribution error. They assumed only an evil person would do an evil thing.
Right, they ignored the situation entirely.
They completely ignored the mechanics of the situation. These participants weren't sadists. They were sweating, trembling, biting their lips, begging the experimenter to let them stop. But the situational forces overwhelmed them.
So what were those specific forces? Why didn't they just stand up and walk out?
First, there was the element of surveillance. The authority figure was physically standing right behind them. When Milgram tweaked the experiment so the researcher left the room and gave orders over a telephone, obedience dropped significantly.
So the physical proximity of authority matters.
A lot. Second, there were psychological buffers. The victim was in another room. When participants were forced to physically press the learner's hand onto a shock plate, obedience plummeted. Distance makes cruelty infinitely easier to execute.
I see how that directly maps onto modern systems. It's, much easier to push a button that drops a drone strike on another continent than to inflict harm face to face.
Absolutely.
But I think the most insidious part of Milgram's design is how it starts. It's what you might call the emerging situation.
That is perhaps the most crucial psychological trap. The experiment doesn't start with the demand to electrocute someone. It starts with just 15 volts, a tiny tingle.
Right.
You agree to that because it's harmless. Then it's 30 volts, then 45. It escalates in such tiny, gradual increments that there is no obvious boundary line to cross.
It's the ultimate slippery slope. Think about it like agreeing to help a friend move.
Oh, good example.
First, they just ask you to help move a couch. You say yes. Then they say, well, since you're here, can we just grab these boxes? Then it's the mattress. By the end of the day, you've moved their entire apartment, and you never would have agreed to that up front.
Exactly.
But because you already agreed to the couch, you feel trapped.
You become imprisoned by your own prior compliance. In Milgram's lab, to suddenly stop at 195 volts requires you to admit to yourself that 180 volts was morally wrong. And no one wants to admit that.
And we know this isn't just an artifact of the past. It's easy to look back at the black and white footage of the 1960s and think, oh, society was just more conformist back then. Today, we are educated, independent thinkers. We would never blindly shock a stranger to death just because a guy with a clipboard told us to.
That is a total myth.
Completely.
It is entirely a myth. In 2009, a researcher named Jerry Berger ran a partial replication of Milgram's study using ethical safeguards that stopped the procedure at the 150-volt mark.
Which is the turning point, right?
Statistically, yes. It's the critical turning point where most participants either quit or commit to going all the way. The results were chilling. Modern participants demonstrated nearly identical rates of obedience to authority.
Unbelievable.
The situational pressures have not diminished one bit over the decades, not to mention things like the Stanford prison experiment, which showed how just assigning roles like guard or prisoner can institutionalize horrific behavior.
Which leaves us with a really dark question. If a situation can pressure us into shocking a stranger or force us to go along with a crowd, how do we live with ourselves afterward? You would think our brains would just short-circuit from the guilt.
They don't short-circuit, they do something much more sophisticated. They adapt. Our minds are incredibly adept at rewriting our internal beliefs so that they perfectly match our past outward behavior.
That is wild.
This is the process of internalization and self-justification.
Let me connect this to a sales tactic mentioned in our sources, the foot-in-the-door technique.
Oh, yes.
If someone knocks on your front door and asks you to erect a massive, ugly, drive carefully billboard on your pristine front lawn, almost everyone will slam the door in their face. But if a few weeks earlier, a different person asked you to put a tiny 3-inch "Be a Safe Driver" sticker in your window.
Which is a request so small and harmless that almost everyone agrees to it.
Right. If you accept that tiny sticker, you are statistically massively more likely to agree to the giant, ugly billboard weeks later.
It's incredible.
And it's all because that first small action forced your brain to rewrite your identity. You tell yourself, well, I put up the sticker. I guess I am the kind of person who cares deeply about safe driving. You justify the small action by changing your internal belief system.
And that's exactly how extremism takes hold.
Right. This is the exact playbook Jim Jones used to build Jonestown. He didn't start by asking normal people to move to a jungle compound and drink cyanide. He asked for an hour of volunteer time.
And then a small financial donation.
Then a weekend retreat. Tiny, incremental commitments that slowly rewrote their identities.
It is a real-world demonstration of Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the intense psychological pain we feel when our actions contradict our deeply held beliefs.
Because we can't go back in time and change what we did?
Exactly. Because we cannot jump into a time machine and undo the physical action we just took, our brain takes the path of least resistance. It simply changes our internal belief to make it align with the action.
Let's break down Festinger's famous peg-turning experiment, because it perfectly illustrates this. He had college students perform a brutally boring task for a full hour, just turning wooden pegs on a board. Mind-numbing work.
The worst.
Afterward, he asked them to do a favor lie to the next participant in the waiting room and tell them the peg task was actually incredibly fun and exciting. He paid half the liars $1 and the other half $20.
Keep in mind, this was the 1950s, so $20 was a substantial amount of cash. The fascinating part is what happened later, when researchers asked the liars how much they actually privately enjoyed the peg task.
You would naturally assume the people paid more money liked it more.
You would.
But it was the exact opposite. The people paid $20, admitted the task was boring. But the people paid only $1, convinced themselves that the mind-numbing task was genuinely fun.
The mechanism there is purely about resolving cognitive dissonance.
Okay, let's unpack this. If someone hands me a $20 bill to eat a truly disgusting sandwich, I know exactly why I ate it.
For the cash.
I did it for the money. My action and my belief make sense together. Zero dissonance. But if I eat that gross sandwich for only $1,
That's a problem.
my brain cannot handle the embarrassment of knowing I sold out my dignity for pocket change. The dissonance is agonizing. So to protect my ego, my brain simply hallucinate a new reality. It convinces me, actually, you know what? That sandwich had a really complex flavor profile. It was a culinary masterpiece.
That is a phenomenal way to explain it.
Mm.
There is also an alternative perspective to consider called self-perception theory.
Hmm.
This argues that we don't even need to feel that agonizing dissonance to change our minds.
Really? How so?
It suggests we operate like outside observers of our own lives. We look at our own actions and deduce our feelings. We say, well, I only got paid $1 and I told that guy it was fun, so logically I must have somewhat enjoyed it.
Regardless of whether it's painful dissonance or cool observation, the outcome is the same. Our behavior dictates our beliefs. And the craziest part of the research is that the self-justification doesn't even require deep, conscious thought. The sources point out that this exact same rationalization happens in patients with severe amnesia who can't even remember the behavior they just did. It even happens in monkeys,
It is a primal, automatic biological function.
which is deeply unsettling when you consider the implications. But we need to scale this up. We've seen how isolated individuals justify their flaws. What happens when you put a group of these biased, self-justifying individuals into a boardroom to make high-stakes decisions?
That is where things get really risky.
Wait, I always thought the entire point of forming a committee was to balance out the extremes. If you have a few hotheads and a few timid people, shouldn't a group decision naturally average out to something cautious and conservative?
That was the standard assumption in organizational psychology for years. But the data proves the exact opposite. Groups do not naturally moderate each other. They polarize.
They get more extreme.
Yes. This is called group polarization. If you take a group of individuals who already lean slightly toward taking a risk, putting them in a room to debate will push the collective decision toward an extreme, risky shift. If they initially lean cautious, the group discussion will make them extremely conservative.
Why does simply talking it out make everyone more extreme?
It comes back to the informational and normative influences we discussed earlier. Informationally, as the group debates, you hear new, persuasive arguments that support your initial leaning, which pushes you further in that direction.
That makes sense.
And normatively, you want to fit in and be seen as a good team player, so you express an even stronger, more confident version of the group's attitude to signal your loyalty.
And if you take that dynamic and add high stress, isolation from outside opinions, and a strong desire for unity, you get a recipe for catastrophe. You get groupthink. The classic historical example is the Bay of Pigs invasion. The president's top advisors were so desperately focused on maintaining a unified front that they actively censored their own private doubts. They completely ignored glaring logistical flaws because no one wanted to be the one to break the consensus.
To dismantle groupthink, organizations have to actively foster norms that reward critical thinking. And importantly, they must prioritize diversity. A diverse group brings inherently different perspectives, which acts as a natural circuit breaker for echo chambers.
Which perfectly transitions us into one of the most heavily debated topics in social policy affirmative action.
Yes, a very complex topic.
Our source material uses the psychological mechanisms we've just discussed to impartially analyze the arguments on both sides of this issue. Let's unpack exactly what the research says, starting with the psychological critiques of these policies.
If we look at the critiques of affirmative action through this psychological lens, a major concern is about unintended stigmatization. Specifically, something called an incompetence inference.
What does that mean?
It's a psychological trap where people assume that a beneficiary of affirmative action only acquired their position because of a demographic quota rather than their actual merit or intelligence.
So even if the person is brilliant, the policy itself creates a shadow of doubt.
Exactly.
And that doubt creates a ripple effect. Non-beneficiaries might feel they were unfairly bypassed, leading to anger and workplace resentment. But the sources also highlight something called a chilling effect on self-view, which affects the beneficiaries themselves.
Yes. If a woman, for example, begins to internalize the idea that she was preferentially selected for a leadership role simply because she is a woman, it actually messes with her own self-confidence.
She starts doubting herself.
Studies show she may evaluate her own leadership skills more harshly and avoid taking on challenging projects because of that internalized doubt.
So those are the psychological risks. On the flip side, proponents of affirmative action argue that these policies are absolutely necessary to correct hidden, systemic biases that are baked into the very metrics we mistakenly believe are purely merit-based.
The sources provide a great example of this regarding university admissions. Take the practice of giving high school students a GPA bump for taking advanced placement classes.
On the surface, that sounds like a pure meritocracy. Harder classes deserve more credit.
But when you look at the systemic situation, high schools in wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods offer vastly more AP classes than schools in lower income or minority neighborhoods. The metric itself is tilted by the situation.
By using affirmative action to correct for those invisible situational advantages, proponents argue we're actually moving closer to a true meritocracy, and the long-term data backs up the success of the beneficiaries.
It really does.
Landmark studies of elite universities show that minority students admitted under these policies graduate at rates totally comparable to their peers, and they frequently go on to become highly active civic and professional leaders.
Furthermore, bringing it back to our discussion on group dynamics, proponents argue that actively engineering diversity in education and corporate boardrooms is the only reliable way to build the heterogeneous groups necessary to cure groupthink.
Because it forces different perspectives.
Exactly. It prevents the catastrophic failures that happen when isolated homogeneous teams validate their own bad ideas.
So after unpacking all of this, what does it actually mean for us? We started this deep dive asking how ordinary people could commit atrocities. And what we've discovered is that the invisible hand of the situation is constantly resting on the steering wheel of our lives.
Your ability to perform a task is shaped by whether someone is watching you. Your willingness to help a dying stranger is governed by how many other people happen to be standing on the sidewalk.
So pervasive.
Your ability to speak the truth is heavily compromised by the opinions of the majority. And your most private, deeply held beliefs are constantly being rewritten by your brain to justify the behaviors that the situation forced upon you.
It is incredibly humbling. I am not immune to this. You listening right now are not immune to this. But there is a final provocative thought I want to leave you with. Everything we have analyzed today, the smoke-filled waiting rooms, ashes lines on a chalkboard, the shock generators, these were all purely physical situations. You are standing in a physical room surrounded by physical people.
But consider where we actually spend the vast majority of our lives today.
The digital world. Think about your social media feeds. That is an environment governed by black box algorithms that are explicitly designed to show you content confirming your pre-existing biases.
It's an echo chamber.
You are surrounded by a virtual, curated crowd of people who already agree with you. If our brains are this remarkably vulnerable to the accidental social cues of a physical room, what happens when our situations and our crowds are highly engineered, algorithmically perfected echo chambers?
If the modern internet is functionally a custom-built situation, explicitly designed by tech companies to polarize groups, capture attention, and foster conformity, it raises a terrifying question. How much of your digital behavior and the private beliefs that result from it is truly your own?
We desperately want to categorize the world neatly. We want to believe that we are fully in control, that every action we take is a pure, unadulterated reflection of our character. But maybe that lens we use to view human behavior is fundamentally correct, because the invisible power of the situation is always there, pulling the strings just out of sight. Something to think about the next time you log on.